Joining me now is our team of reporters, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, and NBC News Chief Washington and Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell is on set with me here. Monica, let me start with you. What a day at the White House it has been. Just bring us up to speed. What is the latest and where do things stand with the meetings right now?
Well, Kelly, they are still meeting, which is an indication just of how detailed these talks need to be when it comes to ironing out these specifics. We know the topic, of course, of the conversation, and President Trump said it himself. He's speaking with European leaders about, quote, who will do what when it comes to security agreements, which Ukraine, of course, is asking for and requiring in order to sign off on any kind of a pathway to peace and any kind of a deal to potentially end this war. But that matter, as you know, is very complex. And the European leaders that have gathered here are essentially saying we want to help and we want to be here to support Ukraine, but they, of course, need to figure out what an end to this war could look like. And I thought it was really notable that the German chancellor was the one who said it's hard to imagine some kind of a deal without getting a ceasefire, even though, as you played there, President Trump has sort of abandoned the desire for a ceasefire in the short term, saying it's better to maybe perhaps get a diplomatic deal. So how they resolve that is a major question here. But the president obviously had a very different meeting with President Zelenskyy in the Oval Office than the one that we remember 6 months ago that really devolved and collapsed and was derailed by the tone. Today, it was far warmer. It was committed to trying to come up with a solution. President Zelenskyy, for his part, Kelly, was also very gracious, thanking the president, thanking the First Lady, thanking the U.S. for weapons, which was a change, remember, from that conversation that blew up 6 months ago because it was Vice President Vance who had accused President Zelenskyy of not saying thank you enough. So this is a different kind of a meeting today in tone and then also in scope because it is involving so many different partners. And we'll see if they come out of this with both the president and President Zelenskyy saying if this goes well, there could be a trilateral meeting with President Putin, but it's unclear depending on what they're able to iron out right now, Kelly.
And certainly the notion of a trilateral meeting, Russia, Ukraine, the United States, that is something that has now become a clear priority for the president. Do we have a sense of the timing of that if it were to happen and what conditions might be required, if any?
Yeah, and President Trump, when he was in Alaska just a couple of days ago, said that he viewed that meeting with President Putin as a way to set the table for the next meeting. And here we are, where we are, of course, seeing these key discussions and negotiations be ongoing, but it is unclear whether there can be a trilateral meeting. The president said as soon as all of this wrapped up at the White House, he was expecting to call President Putin, give him a readout of how this went, and then, yes, potentially invite him along with President Zelenskyy to a meeting in the future. President Trump said it could take place in the next week or 2 weeks. He left that timeline a little flexible there. Remember that the Alaska meeting came together so last minute. It was such a scramble to put together. So maybe there will be a little more time for this one, though that remains unclear too, Kelly, because, again, they have to figure out what that summit will entail. Will there be some kind of an agreement? Is there something that's expected to be signed there? And I think they still have to figure out a lot of outstanding items from the very, very complex conversations today in order to do that.
And among the very complex issues would be territory. How would it be divided, if at all, if that is an absolute condition in order to reach some kind of a peace deal? Any signals about that today?
Well, I thought it was notable, Kelly, and you probably had an eye out for this as well, that there was a map in the Oval Office that President Zelenskyy and Trump were looking at. We saw some behind-the-scenes imagery where they were both standing near it. In fact, President Zelenskyy said that he liked it and wanted to perhaps travel back with the one that was there in the Oval Office. But, of course, that is the key question here. What kind of land, if any, is Ukraine willing to concede? Remember that they have it written into their constitution that there would have to be a referendum, a vote, in order to potentially cede any of that land. And then did President Trump get President Putin to agree to any kind of land negotiations there? Remember, he said that was really going to be up to Ukraine. So that is what we're still waiting to hear more about.
And what underscores your point there is it's a sovereign democracy. They need to consult their constitution and their population to make a big change like that. Thank you, Monica. Appreciate it. And we know we will get back to you if there are any developments in the short while. And let me turn now to Andrea. Good to have you with us here.
Thank you.
What are you hearing from Western sources that you have, Western European sources, about how this is playing out today?
Well, first of all, what we did hear, as Monica was just suggesting, the one person, the one European leader in that room at the larger meeting in the East Room was Chancellor Merz, who was the only one who pushed back and said that there needed to be a ceasefire before the trilateral meeting. And immediately, President Trump pushed back against him, saying, I've made, 6 agreements and ended 6 wars already. That's a sort of an exaggeration.
Very different circumstances, yes.
But there's some differences. But he said, I've done them, and we didn't need a ceasefire in any of them. So he immediately pushed back on that. And that was their main concern, that coming out of the Friday's summit in Alaska, there was no ceasefire, there were no secondary sanctions, there was no pressure as promised if there weren't a ceasefire by the president en route to en route to Alaska on Air Force One. So going to Alaska, he said there would be pressure. Then there wasn't.
Seemed to evaporate.
Afterwards, it did evaporate by the time he was meeting, interviewing with not the press corps, which he rebuffed, but Sean Hannity before getting on the plane to go back. So that was a concern. There was relief that he had not acceded to trading territory and showing, land swaps, at least as far as anyone knows, and that there had been some discussion. And now we see some nailing down of President Putin, at least President Trump says, agreeing to security guarantees. And today, for the first time, the president said, we'll be involved. And how are they going to define that? I would be very skeptical that it would be boots on the ground. And what's really significant is that Steve Witkoff, in interviews this weekend, said it would be some Article 5-like commitment, which is the basic NATO commitment of an attack on one is an attack on all, and all come to the defense of the one. That is something that Donald Trump himself has pushed back on, that if you don't pay enough into NATO,
with existing NATO relationships, he's questioned that.
Members, he said that we wouldn't come to their defense.
Were you struck by how these European leaders were very clear in aligning themselves with Zelenskyy, whereas as we hear President Trump, he's often acknowledging the Russian point of view and President Putin's point of view, as well as talking about his relationship with Zelenskyy. But the Europeans did not do that.
And even the Italian, leader Meloni, who has been very supportive of Ukraine, and even though she's very conservative and is very much aligned with Donald Trump on a lot of other issues, and he's praising her, very generously, she, as well as all of them, are absolutely committed to Ukraine. To them, they see the Russian aggression against Ukraine as an attack on Europe. And it's not just Finland, but certainly most importantly Finland at that table, because Poland it doesn't happen to be there. They have an 800-mile border with Russia.
A young new leader, new to NATO, and he was very clear in his message today among much more senior leadership in Europe. That stood out.
He's also been a golf partner, playing golf, invited guest in Mar-a-Lago. So that is significant.
Using that personal rapport.
That he has that personal rapport. He's been to Florida, and this is the first time that he's in the White House. But he's actually a real comer in terms of being relatively new, obviously Finland, new to NATO, relatively new to NATO, that, the 2 new members are from Scandinavia, and already taking such a high-profile role.
More to watch for that. Thank you, Andrea. Good to have you with us and to have your insights. And joining me now is our chief international correspondent, Keir Simmons, who has, of course, been very at front in our coverage of dealing with Russia and has a perspective there that you can really bring to this. How do you expect Moscow will react to the meetings as they've played out today? What are they looking for, do you think, here?
Well, President Putin said on Friday, it was kind of a throwaway line, but I thought it was notable. He said, we've got something here, we've got a deal, we've got a prospect, unless the Europeans derail it. And the question, I think, now is whether the Kremlin is watching what is happening in the White House, that extraordinary meeting, that bon ami between European leaders and President Trump, and thinking, there you are, that's the Europeans derailing what we thought we had with President Trump. The fact that President Trump kind of seems to shift his position depending on who he's with. And the very fact that those European leaders have raced to Washington, if you like, specifically because they know it's important to get in the room with President Trump. That's something that the Russians are aware of too, and that the Russian officials have talked about that with me, and they know that the challenge is not just about a victory on one day. I will say one thing about this, watching those scenes today with the European leaders, united, purposeful, not arrogant. You find yourself watching that, Kelly, and thinking, are they really European leaders? It's incredible, the stagecraft that you're seeing Europe manage there, and President Zelenskyy, in order to get what they want. It is a diplomatic battle, and I think they recognize that, and they are using every diplomatic tool that they can muster.
And definitely signs, Keir, that there was a meeting before the meeting on the European side, that they had a sense of what they wanted to accomplish in messaging and in tone and in posture, knowing that all of that counts a great deal with President Trump. There, of course, have been discussions today about security guarantees, what that would look like. What is your sense of what Russia would say to discussion of security guarantees if that stops short of what NATO would provide? Is that something that you could see Putin agreeing to?
Well, I think one of the questions is the extent to which President Putin, who has his own political audience, if you like, I know, okay, he's an autocrat, but he still does have to think about what Russian people think, and particularly one group, the hardliners, those who are very pro-war in Russia. How will they respond to any deal he does? So when you just take that question of the suggestion that there might be some sort of Article 5 agreement, and it's not just now messaging from the Trump administration, of course. We saw two European leaders, Meloni of Italy and Starmer of Great Britain, suggest that there is something like that, an all for one and one for all type deal outside of NATO that might be being considered. So back to the question. The question is whether President Putin is looking for what he can sell to his people, whether he's looking for being able to say, you see, I've managed to stop NATO, even if they at the same time have these kinds of security guarantees that look similar to NATO.
Keir, thank you so much for those insights. And we want to get a perspective about Ukraine from Bill Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and the distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Always good to have you with us with your long experience here and your insights. Let me ask you, what is your assessment of President Zelenskyy's meeting today? It appeared he really had taken notes from the last time around and tactically went into this with a different approach. What's your sense?
I agree, Kelly. I agree. I mean, he clearly wants this to be a good meeting, came in very well prepared. The Europeans were very much behind him. So President Zelenskyy knew that there's a lot to be done here, and he knew that he had the opportunity to speak next to President Trump, as Keir just said. The people who speak to him get some influence. And so President Zelenskyy is taking a clear advantage. One thing on this security guarantee, I just want to mention that right since you were just talking about it, it's not clear to me why the Russians get any say on what security guarantee the Europeans or the Americans or NATO or anybody else gives to Ukraine. Seems to me that is a Ukraine, Europe, United States issue. It's not a Russia issue. It's the security guarantee is to keep Russia from invading again. Why would we give them a veto or even a voice on that kind of a question that is designed to keep them from invading again?
Interesting, very interesting point. And is it your sense that having the European leaders at the White House today and the way they spoke about their support for Ukraine, does that reflect strength for President Zelenskyy, or does it suggest that he needed backup?
Clearly strength in numbers. And I think Macron made the point that others have hinted at, and that is, this is about more than Ukraine. The Russians' threat to Ukraine is a threat to Europe. And the Europeans want Ukrainians to win. They certainly want them to prevail. The Ukrainians want the Europeans want the Ukrainians to stop the Russians in Ukraine. Because if they keep coming towards Europe, then Europe is threatened. So Macron expressed it well, that this is about European security.
There's been a lot of talk about a ceasefire. Is that something that needs to happen before any larger peace deal? Obviously, Putin has been reluctant to engage on that. Do you think he sees the interim period as a way to gain perhaps a stronger hand in what the ultimate discussion is? If he backs off on any aggression, does that change his place in the negotiations?
It absolutely does. And I'm sure that's what President Trump was referring to when discussing the ceasefire. Chancellor Merz did raise this issue about a ceasefire, and President Trump kind of pushed back on it, saying, well, we don't really need it. And Trump went on to say that it actually gives one side a strategic advantage. It clearly does. It gives the Ukrainians an advantage if they're not being bombed, if they're not being missile attacked, if attacks aren't going into civilian targets and apartment buildings and children being killed. Yes, it does give an advantage to the Ukrainians. Ceasefire stops the fighting, which is what President Trump has thought about doing the whole time. And he had it in mind as the top priority when he went into that meeting with President Trump. And somehow President Trump changed his mind on that. So hopefully the Europeans will make that point again right now as they're talking to him, that yes, there is a strategic advantage, and it goes to the Ukrainians.
You know the map of Ukraine far better than I do or many in our audience. When you hear discussion of certain territories that Russia would like to claim, either they have military control right now or they want to expand to get it, can you just briefly describe what those represent for Russia in terms of their strategic importance or their resources, or why those are such big targets? Not just land for land's sake, but the purpose that might come with land that is at issue here.
Absolutely, Kelly. And this is a very important point. And the importance to Ukraine. It's not to Russia. Russia just wants to bite off more of Ukraine. But Ukraine needs that area that they are defending right now. They're defending Donetsk. It shows on your map there. Right there are 3 strategic cities. They're called the Fortress Belt. And those Fortress Belt are in the area that Putin wants. Putin wants to wrest that control from Ukraine so that he has the advantage. Ukraine needs those strategic towns to stop the Russians. The Russians have not been, Putin's not been able to take those because the Ukrainians have defended it all along. So the Ukrainians don't want to give it up, certainly not for just handing it over to Putin. One other thing, Kelly, just on this point, people talk about territories. There are 2 ways to talk about territories. One is to acknowledge that the Russians are actually in the territory, are in Donbass, are in Crimea. That's a fact. What people don't want to do, and what the Ukrainians don't want, Europeans don't want, and what we shouldn't want, is to recognize those territories as part of Russia. That's what Russia wants, to recognize them as part of Russia. We can acknowledge that the Russians are there, but we should never give them claim or ownership, sovereignty over those parts of territory.
So much at issue here. Thank you, Ambassador. Always great to talk to you, and your depth of knowledge is really a help to our viewers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.